Once you've sewn these small squares in place, it's time to turn the octagon sashes. These squares are not yet joined to the octagon because I just want to review that while on the square there's only one set of joining guides, on the octagon there are 3 separate sets. The center set is always used when joining octagon pieces to other octagon pieces. The set of joining guides that is closest to what will become your stitching line is the centering guidelines that help you join the octagon to the square at this stitching line. I'm going to zoom in on this seam because I've basted it and I noticed that my square is not lying flat. There's a little gap. That's not a problem. As long as the fabric is flat on the square where it intersects with the joining dots, you're fine. The rest of the fabric can be eased in along this line so that it compensates for the little bit of extra fabric that's on this square. That just happens because it's impossible to be perfect, and sometimes this stitching line is going to be slightly longer than the stitching line it's joined to. I'm going to flip this over. I have a tough time starting on a lot of lumpy fabric, so I always stitch from the part of the seam that doesn't have a lot of layers towards the part of the seam that may have 2 or 3 layers because it's joined at an intersection of many pieces. To make the beveled edges on the octagon, fold down one sash. This is going to be the bottom sash. Next, fold the raw edges of the adjacent sash so that it finishes the edge. Then take that sash and gently pull it so it covers the raw edges of the bottom sash. I experiment with stitching my sashes in 2 different parts because I like to keep the majority of my fabric on the left-hand side of my needle. This means there's less fabric to get caught at the neck of the sewing machine as you're trying to flip everything around. So when I sew down octagons, I'll start at this corner and I'll sew here, flip, sew here, and then I'll stop. Take the project out of the bed of my sewing machine, and then I'll sew another row of stitches. Let me show you, just by following this orange line, how this is effective. So when I position my project underneath my needle, you can see that a very small amount of fabric, only this much, is to the right of my needle, and a very small amounts to the left, in all honesty. But that's going to change as I round the corner. I come down here, stitch down, stitch up, plant my needle and pivot. I still have very little fabric to the right hand side of my needle. When I'm done that, I'm going to turn the corner. Now I have even less fabric to the right hand side of my needle. Stitch down, stitch back, pivot, and now I'm going to have a little more fabric to the right hand side of my needle, but not a lot. Stitch down, do this, and then stop. And the reason that I stopped here is I was going to have fabric on the right hand side of my needle, and there's an argument for me continuing here and then stopping here. It's a personal choice, but I figured I'd have even less fabric if I stitched this later. So let me show you how that works. Now, before I do that, let's talk a little about these thread tails. Oh my goodness, who needs those? So what I always do is, when I end this sort of procedure, I stop and take 2 stitches past where I normally would stop, because normally I'd stop right here at the beveled edge. What I do is I reach underneath with either a stiletto or a pin or something, and I pull both the bobbin and the top thread so that they land in the middle of where my sash will be folded. Then I tie them in a knot, pull those thread tails this way, and then they're going to be covered when the sash is stitched in place. I do the same thing for the top threads where I started, so then I'll never have to worry about those thread tails showing. I'm getting ready to sew down these outside sashes, and this is the only time when I press the sashes in place. I don't press them whenever they're surrounded by other quilt blocks, but if they're on the exterior, I find that I get a much better result if I take a few minutes and press down the sashes. I'm going to be starting from this corner. I'm going to pin my sash in place. This is the only place I'll use pins because I want to see if this forms a nice edge or not. If it doesn't, I'm going to pin any ease in place, staying away from this corner where it intersects all the other pieces and this corner where it intersects the sash down here. Everything else you can use for easing in place or stretching or tucking. So this is going to be the only piece I pin. Then I'm simply going to sew the rest of my sashes, and since they've been pressed already, it'll be super easy. The bright green thread shows the second row of stitching that I did to complete turning the sashes and holding them in place. I personally started here, backstitched, came forward, and continued my seam. You don't have to do that. You can start up here, whatever's easier for you, and you can see my thread tails where I end it, and that's how I complete this. But let's put it underneath the needle of the sewing machine and see how much fabric stays on the left and how much fabric goes to the right. Here's my presser foot. I'm going to position my quilt block underneath my presser foot as if I were preparing to sew it. I personally start here, backstitch and come forward, but you can start here, wherever you like. That's up to you. I just do it twice to keep it consistent with all my other beveled edges. So what will happen is the presser foot will go up and down. I'll plant my needle here and pivot, and then I'll sew this row of stitching down. When I get here, I'm going to plant my needle and pivot. Now, there is a lot of fabric to the right-hand side of the needle and hardly any to the left, but it's very quick, and most of it can hang off the back of your sewing machine. So I come down back to where my sash's edges, pivot, and now you can see there's hardly any fabric over here to the right. Only the edge of the quilt block is here. Go down, plant my needle, stitch down, stitch up, pivot, complete this row of stitching, pivot, stitch down, stitch back, pivot, pivot, here, stitch down, stitch back, pivot, and then come here. And you'll see there's only one quilt block to the right of my needle. And you'll see there's much more fabric on the left-hand side at this point. The reason I choose to do this is I intend to build larger and larger projects, and as I do that, there will be more and more fabric that must be controlled. So I try and anticipate that by learning on the simpler projects how to do a two-step sash turning. And once I've got a habit of that, then I can use it as I build bigger and bigger quilts.